As the federal budget inches closer to being revealed, real questions are being asked about Canada's fiscal sustainability and economic health. With a national debt of over $1 trillion and your share about $30,000 and climbing, is all of this really manageable? To answer, we welcome the return of Aaron Wudrick, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, to discuss all of this with us. Aaron, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
I guess first things first, can you describe in your own words the economic health of our country?
Well, it's pretty grim stuff. I mean, obviously, with the pandemic on and so many shutdowns, it's been a struggle for millions of Canadians and Canadian businesses. The only good news that we got recently on that front is a lot of the forecasts from the big banks and international agencies suggest that next year, 2022, will be a pretty good one. Growth rate of 5%. Granted, that's from a very low starting point because the economy has shrunk. But it's better than hearing that things are going to be sort of continually gray sky going forward. So not so good news for the immediate future, but in the sort of medium term, there might be some silver lining.
Let's take it to another important question connected to that, though. I asked you about the economic health, and you gave the important answer. But we also have to talk about the fiscal health of our Canadian government and the provincial governments. What's your assessment of that?
Well, obviously, there was a whole whack of unplanned spending that went out the door over the last year or so. It is at a scale that we haven't really seen since the Second World War. For most people, nothing in their lifetime of this scale. We're looking at a deficit of over $360 billion. So that's twice the size of the budget itself. It is just off the charts in terms of the size. And, questions are starting to be asked about what comes next. I know a lot of people will agree that in an emergency, they had to spend some money. There was no getting around that. But there needs to be some accountability for what was spent. And more importantly, what comes next? What is the government prepared to do to get spending back under control? Because we've run up the tab a lot, and it's simply not realistic to think that we can never turn that tap off and never find a way to claw our way back to a balanced budget.
Yeah, and I was going to ask this later in the broadcast, but you brought it up now. With the federal budget happening mid-April, I guess all of us kind of were initially expecting that this would be a forward-looking document to, to your point, how do we get ourselves out of this situation or not, depending on the choices the federal government makes. But, with the latest wave 3 of COVID and the lockdowns in various provinces, do you expect that this is going to be a kind of an interim measure now, still looking at fighting COVID rather than looking ahead? What's your prediction?
Yeah, I don't expect there to be a lot of spending reductions, put it that way. I don't expect the government's going to be putting a lot of these temporary programs behind them. And if anything, we're going to see new temporary programs. We've been waiting 2 years for this budget. The argument that the argument that the government has been making all along is that things are changing so rapidly, we can't afford to have a budget. Well, I guess they finally decided they had to come up with one. The thing that I'm really going to focus on looking for in this budget, Tony, is are they going to implement new permanent spending that has nothing to do with the pandemic? If there are measures that are helping businesses and individuals, tiding them over during this time, I think that's reasonable, and we can debate the sort of merits and tinker at the edges. But if they're going to roll out big, new, expensive programs that have nothing to do with the pandemic, that seems like a pretty cynical move to just exploit the crisis as a pretext to do things that they simply wanted to do all along anyway.
Well, stick a pin in that, because we are going to return to that. As the old adage says, never let a good crisis go to waste. We may be in that unfortunate period right now. But we got about less than a minute before the break. But I do want to ask you, your organization, it's always been about current deficits, meaning future taxes. Is that still the thing that you're stressing to people?
Yeah, look, obviously the dynamic has changed a bit, and we need to be realistic about how quickly we can climb out of this. But I think, if anything, Tony, it's actually become a lot more relevant and real to people. Talking about deficits and debt has always been very abstract, but because of this pandemic, most people have personally experienced what it's like and understand what we've had to do. So hopefully that gives people a little more steel when it comes to paying back what we've had to borrow so far.